Hey guys, and welcome to our second video in this verb series. In our last video, we talked about how verbs are the life force of language and that they can express actions, events, states, or processes. And without a verb, you can't have a real sentence in English. So now we're going to go one step deeper. Verbs don't always look the same. They can change their form depending on the sentence. And these changes, called inflections, are what let us show things like tense, person, and number. So in today's video, we'll look at the different forms verbs can take in English. We'll see how regular verbs follow like predictable patterns and how irregular verbs like go and sing break those rules, and why these forms matter for building tense and aspect, which we'll get to in our next video. But by the end, you'll know the 5 core forms every English verb can have, and you'll see how they're the foundation of everything we do with verbs later. So let's start with how English verbs show person and number. Person tells us who is doing the action. So we have first person. This is the speaker, like I or we, right? We have second person, who's the hearer, like you. And third person is everyone else. So he, she, it, and they. So that's probably a concept that makes a little more sense or is familiar to you, right? Now, number, on the other hand, tells us whether we're talking about one or more things. So singular or plural. And in English, verbs only visibly mark number and person in the third person singular present tense. So if you look at the example, the only version of the main verb dance that changes is the one associated with third person singular. That's why we say he dances, she dances, it dances, but everything else uses dance as the verb form. The S ending in dances is how English signals that third person singular present. For all other persons and numbers, the verb form stays the same. Sometimes it's not obvious which word in a sentence is the verb. So here's a quick test, a heuristic you can use to check. Test number 1. Can the word change into the third person singular present? For example, I play can become she plays. Or we review becomes he reviews. Test number 2. Can the word be put in the past tense? For example, I go becomes I went. Or they play becomes they played. So if a word passes either of these tests, it's almost certainly a verb. This works because nouns, adjectives, and adverbs, other parts of speech, don't change in these ways. Only verbs flex to show tense and show aspect. Now let's look at the 5 main forms of English verbs. Now, nearly every verb in English can appear in at least one of these forms. All regular verbs for sure, but we'll look at irregular verbs in a second, and obviously there's special cases with modal verbs and things like that. But in general, most English verbs can appear in one of these forms. But just a note, I'm going to say some terminology that I haven't introduced or explained yet. So if you hear a word like participle or gerund, those will be covered more later in this video. So first, the base form. This is the simplest version of the verb, like walk or sing. We called it that bare infinitive in the last video. So you'll see it used in the present tense with all subjects except third person singular. So I walk or you walk, we walk, but we wouldn't say he walk, right? Instead, we have the S form. This is the third person singular. We just talked about it on the last slide. Like she walks or he walks, it sings. This is the only place in English where verbs still show subject agreement. The third form we have is the ing form, the ing form, and we call this the present participle or sometimes the gerund form. So examples are walking and singing. You'll see this in progressive tenses like I am walking and when verbs function like nouns. Walking is healthy. Fourth is the ed form, the id, like walked form. This is the past tense form. So for regular verbs, it's made with ed, like walked. But for irregular verbs, it can change a lot, like sing becomes sang. And finally, the fifth form, the en or ed form, also called the past participle, For regular verbs, this looks the same as the past tense, okay? Worked and worked, okay? But for irregular verbs, it's often different. For example, sang in the past tense becomes sung as the past participle. So to sum it up, the 5 forms are the base infinitive, bear form, the S, ending a verb with S, ending a verb with ing, ending a verb with ed, and then ending the verb with en or ed. And the big thing to remember is that regular verbs reuse the same form for both past tense and past participle, while irregular verbs often make those 2 forms very different. Okay, but now let's talk about regular and irregular verbs. In plain language, regular verbs are predictable. Irregular verbs are not. They're kind of like exceptions to the rules. So regular verbs form their past tense and past participle in a very predictable way, usually by adding ed. We just said this, right? For example, play becomes played, or for the past participle is still played. Once you know the pattern, you can apply it to almost any regular verb. Irregular verbs, on the other hand, don't follow this pattern. Their past tense or past participle forms are very different. So for example, go, went, gone. All the same verb, right? Just different forms. Sing, sang, sung. Another one I can think of is withdraw, right? So I'm withdrawing money from the bank. So there's withdraw, withdrew, withdrawn. And then in third person singular, it's withdraws. And in present participle form, it's withdrawing. And it's just crazy. That one tripped me up the other day. But the thing is, you just have to memorize these because they don't follow that ed rule. The most common irregular verbs in English are be, have, and do. And they're very important. So not only are they irregular, but they also function as auxiliaries, as we covered in our first video, which means they play a major role in building tense, aspect, and questions, as we saw in that first video. But those 3 verbs would be considered irregular verbs. So the takeaway is this: regular verbs are predictable, irregular verbs are not, and the most frequent verbs in English are often the tricky, irregular ones. Now that we've gone through the different forms verbs can take, you might be wondering, why do these forms matter? And one of the main reasons is what we call agreement. So agreement is how verbs match their subjects in person and in number. So in English, this is actually pretty simple. The only major change happens in the third person singular present tense, as we've been talking about throughout this video since the second slide. So that's it. That's all that happens in English with this. Compared to other languages, English has a very light, very light agreement rules. So understanding agreement is important because it helps us identify finite verbs, the verbs that actually carry tense and show who is doing the action. In the next part here in a minute, we'll use what we know about forms and agreement to introduce finite and non-finite verbs, which is a key concept for building sentences and for understanding verb phrases. So let's get into it. A finite verb is a verb that shows tense, which we'll go more in depth on in the next video, but it shows tense and it shows agreement. It's the verb that tells us when the action happens and who is doing it. For example, I walk to class every day. Walk, the verb walk, is finite because it shows present tense and it matches the subject I. Now consider this. She walks to class every day. Walks is also finite because it shows present tense and it matches she in the third person singular form. So in this case, notice how the verb form changes depending on the subject. That's the essence of finiteness, right? The verb is bound by tense and agreement. Finite verbs are the main verb of the sentence. They show when something is happening. By contrast, non-finite verbs don't show tense or agreement. They don't change form for the subject or for the time frame, right? So non-finite verbs are like helper forms. They can't stand alone, but they add meaning in other ways. We're going to look at some different non-finite verb types here in a second, but just for some immediate examples so you can situate this idea, take the sentence, I like to walk. And to walk is non-finite, right? It doesn't change no matter who the subject is. When I say she likes to walk, To walk stays the same. The only thing that changes actually is the main verb, like, because it changes to likes to match the subject. Non-finite verbs are important because they can't serve as the main finite verb in a sentence by themselves, but they appear in larger verb phrases, like the verb phrase likes to walk or like to walk. So we're going to look at 3 types of non-finite verbs. Let's go into those. An infinitive is the base form of a verb, usually with the word to in front. Think of it as the verb in its pure, raw form. For example, in the sentence, I like to swim. The phrase to swim is the infinitive. Here, it acts like a noun. It's the thing I like. Sometimes infinitives appear without to, after modal verbs like can, must, should, or will. For example, she can go now. In this sentence, go is still an infinitive, just without the to. The important thing to remember is that infinitives don't change for tense or for subject. They always stay in their base form. Another way to think about infinitives is that they're often used like nouns. So compare these 2 sentences. I like cake. Cake is a noun. And I like to swim. To swim is acting like a noun. So an infinitive is basically the verb waiting to do its job in the sentence. A participle is a verb form that can do 2 things. So first, it can help make verb tenses, or second, it can act like an adjective and describe a noun. So there are 2 types of participles, present participles and past participles. Present participles always end in ing. So for example, the baby is crying. Here, crying is part of the verb phrase showing the progressive tense. Look at this example. The crying baby kept us awake. So here, crying is an adjective describing the baby. Now, past participles usually end in ed, for regular verbs at least, or take irregular forms for irregular verbs. So for example, they have eaten. Here, eaten is part of the perfect tense. The broken vase was on the floor. Here, broken is an adjective describing the vase. So a quick tip, the word past and present don't always match the time of the action. So for example, I will be released tomorrow. Released is a past participle, but the action happens in the future. So remember, participles are versatile. They either help form tenses or they modify nouns, like adjectives, right? Now, a gerund is a verb that ends in ing, just like a present participle, but it acts like a noun. So for example, swimming is fun. Here, swimming is the subject of the sentence, or in he enjoys reading, reading is the object, right? But it's acting like a noun. So the key difference between a gerund and a participle is its function. A gerund acts like a noun and can be a subject, object, or part of a noun phrase. A participle acts like an adjective or part of a verb phrase. So let's compare 2 sentences. Walking is healthy, and the walking man looked tired. So in the first sentence, walking is helping. Walking helps and is healthy. Walking is a gerund acting as the subject, right? It's in the subject position. When we look at the walking man looked tired, walking is a participle modifying the noun man, so acting as an adjective. Another example we could say is smoking is bad for you. Smoking is in the subject position. It's the gerund, right? It's the subject. Or singing birds woke me up. Singing is in the participle form describing birds, right? So it's looking like an adjective there. So to sum it up, gerunds are verbs used as nouns and participles are verbs used as adjectives or in verb phrases. So the big takeaway from today is this. Verb forms are our building blocks. Once we know what forms are possible, we can start to see how English uses them to build bigger meanings. That's where tense and aspect come in. Tense tells us when something happens, past, present, or future. I use future in quotes. Aspect tells us how the action is viewed. So whether it's ongoing, completed, or repeated. For example, if I say she walked, that's past tense, right? If I say she is walking, that's the progressive aspect. If I say she has walked, that's the perfect aspect. So why does this matter? Because once you recognize verb forms, you'll be able to predict and understand these tense and aspect patterns much more easily. And that's exactly what we'll explore in our next video.